Welcome to Compact Mysteries from CompactHistories.com, the show where we try to unravel a different bite-sized mystery each week, from baffling disappearances and strange objects to unexplained events and mysterious places. Before we start, a quick announcement. A brand new podcast is joining the Compact Histories family. It's called Compact Science, and it brings you clear, straightforward explanations of science-related topics, all in the same short, bite-sized format. Look out for Compact Science wherever you get your podcasts and on CompactHistories.com, launching next week. With that being said, let's get back to the show. This is episode 70, The Mystery of the Isdal Woman. On the 29th of November 1970, a man and his two daughters were out walking in Isdalen, a steep valley on the outskirts of Bergen in western Norway, when they came upon a scene that looked less like an accident and more like the start of a nightmare. Lying among rocks on the hillside was the burned body of a woman. Her body had been badly charred, her face was difficult to recognize, and the ground around her was scattered with strange objects that immediately suggested this was no ordinary death. More than 50 years later, that unknown woman is still remembered simply as the Isdal Woman, and her case remains one of Norway's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Isdalen was already an eerie place to find a body. The valley had a grim reputation long before 1970 and was sometimes nicknamed Death Valley because of its dangerous terrain, hiking accidents, and earlier associations with suicides. This gave the location an immediate atmosphere of dread, but it did not explain what police found there that day. Near the woman's body were several items that had also been affected by fire, including bottles, a scarf, an umbrella, pieces of clothing, and personal effects. Investigators also noted something that would become a defining feature of the entire case. Labels and identifying marks had been removed from belongings at the scene. Right from the beginning, this suggested a deliberate effort to make the woman harder to identify. The body itself deepened the mystery. She had been lying on her back, with her arms drawn upward near her torso. Parts of her clothing had been burned away, and the fire damage was severe enough that the first people to see her could not possibly have known who she was. Police moved quickly, treating the area as a major investigation site rather than dismissing it as a tragic but simple death in remote country. The strangeness of the scene demanded that response. This was not just because of the fire, but because of the unsettling mixture of destruction and order, as though somebody had tried to erase a person while still leaving behind a careful arrangement of objects. At that moment, the mystery had no name beyond the valley itself. There was no passport, no handbag full of useful documents, no obvious story that could be attached to the dead woman. There was only a body, a bleak Norwegian hillside, and a set of clues that seemed designed to raise more questions than answers. Who was she? Why was she there? How had she died? And why did the scene look as if someone had taken pains to strip away the ordinary details that allow the dead to be known? Those questions did not yet come with theories about spies, false identities, coded notes, or international travel. All of that would emerge later. At the beginning, there was only the discovery in Isdalen, stark and baffling, and the realization that this was a case in which even the victim's name had been burned out of reach. That was the first layer of the mystery, and it was enough to ensure that the woman found in the valley would not be forgotten. 3 days after the body was discovered in Isdalen, the case took a sharp turn from disturbing to deeply peculiar. Investigators found 2 suitcases linked to the dead woman at Bergen railway station, and those cases changed the nature of the mystery almost at once. Up to that point, police had a body in a remote valley and a grim collection of scorched objects. Now they had luggage, and luggage usually means identity, travel, and answers. In this case, it mostly meant the exact opposite. Inside the suitcases was a carefully assembled little world, but not one that made ordinary sense. Police found clothing, shoes, makeup, wigs, maps, timetables, a notepad, cosmetics, non-prescription glasses, sunglasses, coins from several countries, and cash, including 5 100 Deutsche Mark notes hidden in the lining of one case. There was also Norwegian currency, along with Belgian, British, and Swiss coins, suggesting a woman who had moved through different places and carried signs of several lives at once. The contents hinted at travel and planning, but not at a straightforward holiday or a normal business trip. It was as though she had packed for movement, disguise, and reinvention rather than comfort. What made the discovery especially striking was not simply what was there, but what was missing. As at the death scene, identifying information had been removed. Labels had been cut from clothing, names had been rubbed away, and anything that might have pointed cleanly to a manufacturer, a shop, a country, or an owner had often been stripped out. That repeated pattern was impossible to dismiss as a coincidence. Someone, whether the woman herself or another person, had made a sustained effort to reduce the traceable details in her possessions. It gave the whole case a strange, almost staged quality, as if the evidence had been edited before the police ever saw it. The luggage also suggested a woman who paid close attention to appearance. The wigs and cosmetics implied that she may have changed how she looked from place to place, while the glasses found in the cases were not prescription lenses, raising the possibility that at least some of them were worn more for effect than necessity. Even before police built a fuller timeline of her movements, the suitcases pointed towards someone who travelled lightly in some ways and deliberately in others. This was not random clutter from an unremarkable journey. These were possessions that hinted at choice, concealment, and performance. Yet for all their oddity, the suitcases still did not answer the most basic question. They gave police a profile of habits, not a name. They suggested movement, but not a home. They implied planning, but not purpose. Instead of solving the case, the luggage widened it. The unknown woman was no longer only the victim found on a bleak hillside above Bergen. She had become someone who had passed through stations, hotels, and borders, while leaving behind almost nothing solid enough to hold. And from that point on, the investigation was no longer just about how she died, but about who she had been while she was alive. As police worked through the contents of the suitcases and the notes found among the woman's belongings, a clearer pattern began to emerge, but it was not the sort that solved the case. It made it stranger. The dead woman had not been moving through Norway under a single identity. She had been checking into hotels under a succession of false names, using different personal details, shifting addresses, and altering the small facts that usually anchor a traveller to the real world. Instead of one life, she appeared to have been carrying several. By decoding entries in her notepad and comparing them with handwritten hotel registration cards, investigators concluded that she had travelled through places including Bergen, Oslo, Stavanger, Trondheim, and even Paris, using at least 8 aliases and apparently multiple false passports. The names attached to those hotel stays included Geneviève Lancier, Claudia Tielt, Claudia Nielsen, Alexia Zahn Merches, Vera Jarl, Fenella Lork, and Elizabeth Lienhauer. The details attached to these identities shifted from one registration to the next, with different birthplaces, different addresses, and different backgrounds. Yet one detail appeared again and again. She often claimed to be Belgian. The forms were filled out in French or German, which added another layer to the puzzle and hinted at someone comfortable moving between languages as well as identities. What made this especially significant was that the names did not stand up properly when checked. Most of the street names and addresses she gave were false or misleading. The aliases looked convincing enough to get through hotel desks, but they did not lead investigators back to a genuine home, employer, or family. They were masks, not trails. This told police that the false identities were not improvised in panic after some sudden crime. They appeared to be part of the way she lived, or at least part of the way she travelled. Whoever she was, concealment seems to have been built into her routine. The hotel staff who remembered her added a little colour, but not much certainty. She was described as well-dressed, watchful, and self-contained. She sometimes changed rooms after checking in, which may have meant caution, paranoia, or habit. She told staff that she was a travelling saleswoman or an antiques dealer, respectable enough explanations on paper, but vague enough to reveal almost nothing. Witnesses also said she wore wigs and spoke or appeared to understand several languages, including German, French, Flemish, and some English. All of that made her seem worldly and mobile, but also carefully difficult to pin down. By this stage, the question was no longer simply who had died in Isdalen. It was how many versions of herself this woman had presented before she died, and why. The aliases did not identify her. They proved instead that anonymity was not an accident in this case. It was a method, and that pushed the investigation into its next phase, tracing not just false names on paper, but the people who may have seen the real woman behind them. After police established that the dead woman had travelled through Norway under a string of false identities, the next task was to work out where she had actually gone and who had seen her along the way. This was where the case should have become clearer. Instead, it became more elusive. By decoding the notes found in her belongings and matching them with hotel records, investigators were able to reconstruct parts of her journey through Bergen, Oslo, Stavanger, Trondheim and Paris. Yet even with that progress, her movement still seemed oddly fragmented, as if only parts of her life had passed through the official world of hotel desks, train stations and receipts. Witnesses gave police a picture of a woman who stood out without ever quite becoming knowable. Staff at the Hotel Horderheimen in Bergen, where she stayed in room 407 before checking out on November 23, 1970, described her as attractive, dark-haired and cautious. They said she spent much of her time in her room and appeared to be on guard. When she left, she paid in cash and asked for a taxi. That moment mattered because it was the last confirmed sighting before her body was found on November 29th, but it also opened a gap that investigators never managed to close. What happened between the hotel checkout and the discovery in Isdalen remains uncertain. Other witnesses added details that were intriguing but frustratingly incomplete. People who encountered her in different hotels said she often changed rooms after checking in, a habit that could suggest nervousness, tradecraft, or simply a preference for control. One witness reported overhearing her speaking German with a man in a Bergen hotel. That sighting was especially significant because it hinted that she was not always travelling alone, yet it did not provide a name, a useful description, or a firm lead that police could push much further. The transport trail was just as slippery. The taxi driver who took her from the hotel to Bergen railway station was never identified during the original investigation. Later, in 1991, an anonymous taxi driver claimed that after picking her up, another man joined them before they reached the station. If true, that would suggest she was meeting someone in the final known stage of her journey. But because this account emerged years later and anonymously, it added possibility rather than certainty. It was one more shadow passing across the case, not a solution. An even more haunting witness account surfaced decades later. In 2005, a Bergen man said that 5 days before the body was discovered, he had seen a woman he believed was the Isdal Woman walking on the hillside at Fløyen, lightly dressed for the terrain and moving ahead of two dark-coated men who looked foreign or Southern European. He later said she seemed distressed and almost ready to speak, but did not. According to his account, when he tried to report this at the time, he was told to forget it, and no formal record was made. Whether that encounter was truly her cannot be proved, but it sharpened the sense that crucial moments in her final days may have slipped past police before they were properly captured. So by the time investigators had mapped her movements as far as they could, they were left with a strange outline rather than a biography. They knew she had travelled, checked into hotels, changed rooms, paid in cash, and spoken to people in several languages. They knew she had been seen, but not understood. The trail was not empty, but it was full of gaps, and those gaps mattered. They made it impossible to say with confidence whether she was hiding from someone, working for someone, meeting someone, or simply living a life built on secrecy. That uncertainty led directly into the next stage of the case, where the official investigation began to show its limits. By the time police had traced the dead woman's aliases, mapped parts of her journey and gathered witness descriptions, the investigation had produced an extraordinary amount of detail without producing the one thing it most needed, a verified identity. That failure shaped everything that followed. The official inquiry was extensive by the standards of the time. Bergen police opened a major case, circulated descriptions internationally through Interpol, examined her belongings, and attempted to connect her hotel registrations, movements, and physical characteristics to a real person. Yet, for all that effort, the case began to fray at exactly the point where it should have tightened. The more investigators uncovered, the less ordinary the story became. The autopsy only deepened that sense of instability. Examiners concluded that the woman had died from a combination of phenobarbital ingestion and carbon monoxide poisoning. Soot in her lungs indicated that she had still been breathing during the fire, which ruled out the simple idea that someone had burned a corpse after death. Bruising was also noted on her neck, though its exact significance was uncertain. Near the body and in her stomach were large quantities of sleeping tablets, and the official view settled on likely suicide. Even then, however, the evidence did not sit neatly. The scene was strange. The effort to remove labels and identifying marks was sustained, and the total picture felt more deliberate than despair usually does. That tension between the official conclusion and the unsettling details would become one of the defining features of the case. Another problem was the speed with which the case lost momentum. Despite the scale of the original inquiry, the woman was never identified, and the case was closed relatively quickly. That closure did not mean the mystery had been solved. It meant, rather awkwardly, that the investigation had run into a wall. Police had a dead woman, multiple aliases, international movements, and possessions that seemed chosen to conceal her identity, yet they could not convert any of that into a name, a family, or a confirmed nationality. Composite sketches were circulated, but no breakthrough came. The woman remained trapped in official records as an unknown. Her burial in February 1971 captured that unresolved quality in a stark, almost symbolic way. She was given a Catholic funeral in an unmarked grave at Mullendal Cemetery in Bergen, a decision reportedly influenced by the saints' names she had used on hotel registration forms. Even in death, then, the authorities were relying on fragments from her invented identities, rather than anything that could be proved about her actual life. It was as if the aliases had begun to outlast the person. This was the point at which the investigation ceased to be just a police matter and became something colder and more lingering, a case full of official findings that never quite resolved into certainty. The verdict said one thing, the evidence kept hinting at others, and the missing identity sat at the centre of it all like a locked door. That is why the Isdal Woman did not fade into a routine cold case. The investigation had done a great deal, but it had not closed the mystery. It had preserved it. What keeps the mystery of the Isdal Woman alive is not just that she was never identified, but that every attempt to explain her seems to make the case larger rather than smaller. Some unsolved cases survive because the evidence is thin. This one survives because the evidence is unusually rich and still refuses to settle into a single believable story. There was a body in a remote Norwegian valley, a trail of aliases across hotels and cities, luggage stripped of labels, coded notes, wigs, cash in several currencies, and an official conclusion that never fully satisfied the facts. That combination is why the case still grips people decades later. Part of the reason it still haunts Norway is that the Isdal Woman was never allowed to become ordinary. She was not identified, no family convincingly came forward, and even her burial reflected uncertainty rather than closure. In February 1971, she was buried in an unmarked grave in Bergen, in a zinc coffin so that her remains could be preserved in case the investigation ever needed to return to them, with the authorities acting as if the final answer might still lie ahead. More than half a century later, that answer still has not arrived. What has changed is the quality of the questions being asked. In 2017, stable isotope analysis of her teeth suggested that she was probably born around 1930, plus or minus a few years, in or near Nuremberg in Germany, and that she likely spent part of her childhood around France or the French-German border. That did not identify her, but it narrowed the possibilities and shifted the case away from pure folklore and back toward forensic investigation. Later reporting connected those findings with the idea that she may have been raised in a French-speaking environment, perhaps in Belgium, which fits some of the language clues from the original investigation. The case also endured because modern storytelling brought it back into public view. In 2018, the BBC World Service and NRK released the podcast Death in Ice Valley, which reopened the mystery for an international audience and drew in new tips, new witnesses, and renewed forensic interest. That podcast did not solve the case, but it helped turn the Isdal Woman from an old Norwegian file into a living cold case again. Even now, people continue to debate whether she was a spy, a courier, someone fleeing a private life, or a woman caught in circumstances that only looked theatrical because so much of her identity had been stripped away. And that is really why the Isdal Woman still lingers in the imagination. The mystery is not only who she was, but how a person could move through hotels, stations and borders, be seen by so many people, and still disappear so completely into history. Most unsolved cases leave a blank space. This one leaves the outline of a whole hidden life, and that is far harder to let go of. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Mysteries, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmysteries.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and true crime. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/mysteriescoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.